Hey, let's talk about Trump's tariffs. The way that the academics and the pundits are discussing it shows you how out of touch they are. Even Lawrence Summers, all the way down to Mohammed El-Arian, who is probably the most competent economist in America, they don't quite understand how business works. And so ultimately, what you have to understand is that the world economy runs on basically oil and gas, but also on the integrity of the financial system. So you have one without the other, and you will have collapse. And what's happened essentially is that the euro used to be able to compete with the United States in terms of monetary velocity. What's velocity? In finance, it just means money that's flowing through the system. And you want that because it means that stuff, right, is being traded. People want stuff from other countries, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, if you just have money sitting in a bank, it's useless. So the whole point of monetary policy is how to get a sufficient number of savings that then create momentum, that creates some sort of a loop, right? Some sort of a flywheel of economic activity that sort of builds on each other and creates comfortable levels of price rises. Whether it's somebody buys a house, and so on and so forth. You want those price rises so that people can be comfortable spending a lot of money, or most likely borrowing money at certain interest rates in order to think down the line and think long term. So the point of tariffs in this context is fairly simple. Number one, most of the American banks would not lend Trump money. He declared bankruptcy quite a few times. At one point, only Deutsche Bank, the Germans, and the Saudis were essentially propping up. This is my opinion, by the way. It's just an opinion, and he's a public figure. Ultimately, you had basically the Saudis and the Germans financing Trump. And so if you think of it that way, it's very interesting, right? Because ultimately, the Saudis probably own a lot of land in the United States, particularly in Texas, or anywhere that's got oil and gas, right? And so you can think of the world economy as, what you and I see, right? So I'm sitting here now and I'm looking at a hotel in a very nice, high-rise building. I'm looking at, two very comfortable beds. I'm looking at water. I'm looking at, clothing. But ultimately, what a lot of people don't necessarily see, even when they walk outside, is just how much oil and gas dominates world economy, world economic indicators. Those are all cars in Jakarta, and all of them run on oil. And you can see how this is just the afternoon. It's not even rush hour. And so it's not very obvious to somebody who's maybe in New York taking a subway, or in Chicago taking the L, or even in a small town in America. But the fact of the matter is, the velocity of money as of today basically runs on oil, the transport of oil, and the protection of oil, which is the military, and particularly the Navy. And now intelligence, which is surveillance, software, and so on and so forth. So you've got basically technology and oil. And technology is digital, right? So it's not necessarily a large part of the overall economy. What it is, it underpins, right? It captures consumers, right? What am I doing now? I'm sending you this message from an iPhone that basically has captured the information and can then use AI to process the information. So it doesn't necessarily show up as much in the economic numbers. What the fact of the matter is that coffee, all this other stuff that you see is minuscule compared to everything that's out there. Because so much of it is not as visible as the automobile that you see outside. The power, the lights, what's fueling all of that, right? The air conditioning, what's fueling all of that? And then you've got all the byproducts. You've got the plastics and so on. What has happened with the ESG movement is that they've tried to do something about that. They've tried to move away from it, but it hasn't worked. Whatever they've come up with is decades away from utilization if you include infrastructure. So in other words, you can build an electric car. China's done it, right? No problem. But what you need is the infrastructure for charging. You need it to be faster as well. You don't want to be stuck somewhere on a vacation and not be able to fuel up quickly or charge quickly. And the United States has the technology, but it does not have the infrastructure because of its multi-layered governmental system that allows somebody at the local level to basically trump somebody else's policies at the national level, particularly when you're dealing with private property. And you can't condemn all the property out there, right? So the reason that China has been so successful is, number one, they have oil, but not much. And they wanted to immediately move away from that. That's how they became a superpower. They managed to basically insulate themselves from an oil price shock. And that's why they're a superpower now. You can't become a superpower unless you're independent of the American paradigm of oil and gas. And China's done it. But it's been able to do it because, again, you're not necessarily dealing with private property impeding infrastructure rollout. You want to have a charging station every 6 blocks? You can do it in China. Not a problem, right? You're not going to run into some local official that's different from a different party than you are, and that might put up roadblocks because he or she wants to take credit. So China has been very successful with anything ESG, environmentally friendly, simply because it's, this is where the communist system really works. When you're trying to do infrastructure on a mass scale, communism works. You know this already, right? What's on the Soviet flag, right? The hammer and the sickle, right? Farming and building. And even now you go to Eastern Europe, what the Soviets built, in many cases is still there in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria. It's still there. It works. It's not the best high-tech stuff, but it works. So I joke sometimes that the United States has been building capacity for propaganda and software and media, while the communists and the Russians and the Chinese have been perfecting infrastructure. And even now, I'm taking an elevator in this American hotel. It's made by Hyundai, right? It's made by a non-American company. And so the Asians, because of their ability to not necessarily copy, but just for their proximity to China, are able to see what the Chinese are doing and sort of copy it and maybe try to put an IP restriction on it and so on and so forth. But again, let's go back to what Trump was trying to do. And I apologize that it's taken so long to get here, because I understand it, and I just feel like it's so tragic that the smartest minds at Harvard and the Fed don't get what I get. And here we go. Trump wants the U.S. dollar to be the primary foundation of monetary policy and velocity. To do that, remember, they already blew up the pipeline that was allowing the Europeans to use the euro through and by Russian oil and gas, therefore allowing the euro to be a major part of SWIFT. Essentially, the technological system and legal system and conduit that allows you to control finance and therefore the economy. So you want to put sanctions on somebody, say you can't use SWIFT, right? Well, it doesn't help if they can, just go to the Europeans and get some sort of ID and just go ahead and use a system. You want to be able to create a system where you have cooperation. And ultimately, you do that by dominating that velocity. And so after the Russian pipeline to Europe blew up, the euro as a share of SWIFT, this money conduit that is necessary for the financial integrity of all transactions in the West, right, collapsed. And ultimately, now, it used to be that the euro was going to reach parity with the dollar within the SWIFT system. It was on its way there. And again, shows you how powerful oil is, right? All over the world. And ultimately, now the euro essentially collapsed within SWIFT as a share of transactions. And the United States is sitting there all alone, by itself, at the top. And so how do you maintain that? Your only competition at this point is the Japanese yen, right, and the euro. So how do you maintain that peak? You don't care about cars, about Hyundai or Honda coming in and selling you Honda Civics, right? What you care about is maintaining that dominance in that structure. So what you tell the country is, listen, your economy is based a lot on, and your debt is based a lot on assumptions of selling in the US dollar and getting that money back into your economy, right? And I'm going to disrupt those assumptions by putting a tariff, right? I'm going to do a 10% tariff right off the bat, right? Maybe a 20% tariff, or I can do whatever I want. I'm in charge of this integrity of the financial system because I now dominate the velocity of transactions within that system. And I can also use sanctions and so on. Now, I cut people out of the system like the Russians, for example. And so now, a couple of things, right? First of all, that creates middlemen, right? If the Russians can't do something, they go to Dubai or someone else, right? If India wants to do something, they can also, they may not be part of the system. They may have a different currency system. They may not have debt in US dollars as much. If they're technologically based, remember you're dealing with a different kind of a system. So again, it doesn't apply across the board. But what you do is you tell these countries 10% tariffs, but maybe I'll make an exception for all these huge companies, right? The Hondas, the Hyundais, or whatever, if you buy oil and gas, more of it from us. And that way, I dominate, again, the entire financial system in the West. And I maintain my position, and nobody can catch up to me. The tariffs are essentially a negotiation tactic. right? You'll put tariffs on anything, right? Whatever you're selling, we'll put a tariff on it. You don't care about the actual product, right? Maybe you'll invent national security concerns, right? You'll invent product liability concerns. What you're trying to do is tell them, listen, I'm going to, you move it up and down like a lever, just like interest rates. Move it up and down like a lever until you buy more oil and gas from me, thereby solidifying my position and keeping you away, more importantly, from buying oil and gas from the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the Venezuelans, right? And I maintain my military power as well, right? And I can also attract the best talent, right? Because money talks, right? It attracts talent. It's not going to do anything sitting there in a bank. A strong currency attracts talent. And Trump, by the way, is essentially the personification of a multinational real estate empire, right? And now he's joined forces with the multinational technological powers, right, in Bezos and Musk and so on. It's going to be very difficult to displace these people because a lot of that technology that Musk and Bezos came up with was designed to actually impede on the real estate tycoons' control of local markets. So if you're a real estate tycoon, you can take over the police department. You can then take over the port authority of some sort, and then control what products come in. You can invent different forms that somebody just didn't fill out or know about on the local level, right? And then at that point, send that shipment back. And you keep doing that. At some point, shipping insurance goes up, and essentially you're dealing with a system that you control in terms of your preferred suppliers. But the tariffs are so simple once you understand this 10-minute discussion. All you're trying to do is maintain your position within SWIFT. Now, what's going to happen? Is it going to work? If the tariffs are negotiated properly, it should work, right? Why? Status quo always has an advantage unless things get disruptive, right? Always has an advantage. But you can see how a lot of people are just not happy with just the overall system. I mean, Jakarta should not be looking like this at 3 p.m. That's not a livable city. So what's really happening is, again, the more oil and gas you buy from the United States, they're not interested necessarily in fixing any of this. It's not going to fix it. So you have an incentive to go back and basically try to move away from it, but how? And you can look at BRICS. You can see how that's sort of trying to cudgel its way in. But the real problem is that a lot of the property here is essentially a dynasty, right? You have Prabowo in Indonesia, who's essentially related to Suharto from the past. And so why is that? I've got to be careful here. So ultimately, the real estate, like when Suharto was backed up by the United States, hypothetically speaking, you can buy a lot of property here and then maybe have an offshore account, show the holder of a shell corporation within Indonesia, right? So essentially you have a local owner, but that person might just be a figurehead that's related to some family that lives here. And then if that family member doesn't cooperate, maybe you shoot the guy, I don't know, you remove him, you exile him somewhere. You can see how the Europeans were very good at doing this, right? And then somebody else next in line comes in, and then that trust or whatever it is just located somewhere, it's really in the hands of a U.S. bank that then owns, say, the property that the tobacco plantations are on, right? That sends tobacco to Philip Morris, the oil and gas that sends it through OPEC, right? Which is, again, Saudi finance, which goes right to the United States and dominates the whole world economy. You do all of that, right? So suddenly you have a country with the most natural resources in the area, I think. Copper, gold, you name it. But the land, right? The land is really dominated by title that is difficult to sort of figure out. And so the people here don't necessarily improve the land or the property. There are so many dilapidated buildings out here because, again, the property owner, the real one, might be, I'm not saying they might be somewhere else, and they're not interested in doing anything except maybe getting a rent. Even if they're not getting rent, you've got to find the guy, right? You don't even know if it gets complicated enough and somebody dies out, there's not necessarily an incentive to fix anything. So you have all these bustling businesses, particularly in food, because they come and they go, right? And there's no real middle class in many countries where property concentration it exists. Particularly not if the Catholic Church is involved. Another real estate tycoon, but doesn't pay taxes, right? Exempt from taxes. If you can do that, you're doing very well. But again, what happens to the Filipinos? What happens to the people in Timor-Leste? They're poor. They can't quite get into that middle class section because that velocity of money is concentrated only in the hands of a few people. And then they buy out the politicians and so on and so forth. And so, again, how do you disrupt all this? Well, China's trying, but, obviously, if it has a policy of non-interference, which it created actually in Indonesia and Bandung, which is signed off on when it was a new country, the policy of non-interference in 1955. Well, how do you do all that, right? And that's, again, a question that's going to be hopefully answered at some point in the next 4 years. But ultimately, you're going to look at a very powerful country trying to solidify its status within the international monetary system through oil and gas, using tariffs as a negotiation tactic. That's all. It's not that hard to me. It's really, really obvious when you travel. But I don't know. Maybe it's different from what you're looking at in a nice office in Harvard.